So, it's 1913, Europe. Europeans would probably say that they were the most sophisticated people on the planet. What happened over the next 4 years? An insane bloodbath, started by some archduke being assassinated, and then arcane, insane loyalties and machismo and pride and all sorts of, there's no other word for it, insanity. So how does a culture that considers itself sophisticated, I'm talking about Europe at that point as an embodiment of Western culture, allow itself to descend into that kind of insanity? I think that's emblematic of this haiku, what I'm trying to say here. Now, Western culture has a lot to offer, and it's wonderful, and I'm glad I'm in it. But I think it's important to have perspective on it. And maybe not to think about it so much as sophisticated, but as specialized. I think that's a more distinctive and appropriate way to characterize Western culture. And why is that important? Because I think it's important to know what you can look to your culture to give you and what your culture is not so much good at giving you. That was a very sophisticated sentence. And what our culture cannot give us, we all know what it can give us. iPhones, there you go. I don't have to say anymore. What it can't give us is meaning, fulfillment, a sense of belonging. And this is the modern angst, the modern ailment, the anxiety that amidst all this convenience, unprecedented convenience in human history. And we're all rushed and anxious and afraid and often empty feeling. What Western culture does and has been doing, sort of the trend of it, is to specialize, to narrow our focus down into very narrow disciplines. We divide the world up. There's physics, there's chemistry, there's biology, there's sociology, there's psychology, there's religion, there's love, there's everyday activities, there's supernatural things, there's dreams. And then we have people who tend to specialize in all these things. Let's throw in literature and art, by the way, kind of a big one. We are not short on knowledge. What we're short on is stepping back and getting an integrated feeling of wholeness, putting things in perspective. So I'm not talking about being anti-intellectual. An anti-intellectual rejects this kind of specialized knowledge. I'm not rejecting it. What intellectuals can get trapped in is going down a rabbit hole of tunnel vision where you believe your discipline is the most important one, the really fundamental explanation. So if you're Richard Dawkins, genes run everything. If you're a theoretical physicist, the impersonal laws of physics run everything. If you're a classics professor, guess what? Our savior lies in rediscovering the classics. If you're a depth psychologist, you have to go into your Jungian archetypes. That's the answer. You see this a lot in theoretical physicists who speculate about ultimate reality and reality as a whole. And those theoretical physicists are especially prone probably to doing that because there's this idea that they are looking at reality at the deepest levels. So it makes sense that they would start to speculate about ultimate reality. But very often, without knowing it, they are still in a rabbit hole to some extent. They're not interested in seriously exploring, for instance, shamanic experiences, Eastern wisdom and experiences of yogis, or any number of thousands and thousands of supernatural, quote, experiences that people have, from ESP to premonitory dreams to out-of-body experiences. These things are just shut out. They're not part of the conversation. They're not explored deeply and sincerely. So we like to chop the world up into separate bits and then study the little bits. And again, this is really helpful, especially for technology and convenience. We need to separate what's convenient, or you could say practical to some extent, from what's ultimately true or ultimately meaningful and really valuable, the most valuable thing, what we're really looking for in our hearts. And this idea of wholeness isn't just a nice idea, or this idea that there are no boundaries. It's not just a nice idea. It's true. Think about anything, whether it's a concept or an object or a person, anything. There are no boundaries. There are no fundamental divisions. If we just go to the most obvious things like objects in front of us, I'm looking at a microphone right now, quantum physicists tell us that at the most fundamental level, objects aren't really objects. They are somehow waves, and they are somehow spread across the universe, and they are somehow interacting with all the other forces and particles in one universal wave function. If you talk about a discipline like chemistry, we call chemistry a thing, but where does chemistry actually stop and then biology begin, right? Because chemicals make up our bodies and contribute to our biology. Where do chemicals bleed into physics? Because chemicals are made of protons and neutrons and the things that physicists study. Then go to any concept, patriotism. Where the hell are the borders to patriotism? Where's the definition of it? Race, we throw around the word race as if it's distinct, as if blacks and whites, say, are separate, when in fact, pretty much everybody is a genetic mongrel. We're all blended, and we're blending more and more. Take red. When does red become orange? Take the discipline of science itself. We talk about science like it's a thing. Science isn't a thing. Science is something that human beings practice, humans that work in universities, humans that have to get funding, humans that are only interested in certain things or can only get money and time to study certain things. So in other words, science isn't a thing that's separate from human beings. Human beings are the ones trying to live up to an ideal called science. And I talk about this a lot in a book I wrote called The Science Spell, if you're interested in exploring this idea a little more. And I talk about the concept that there are actually no inherent divisions anywhere in an essay called Division Vision, which is in another book of mine called Of Geometry and Jesus. So all these concepts and words and things that we throw around as if they are separate, we just do this habitually, but everything is blended. Your experience right now is blended. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, images, smells, sounds, our very experience in every moment is a big stew. So it's not a question of one culture is better than another. It's just a question of having perspective on a culture. And to assume our culture is more sophisticated than other cultures, past cultures, tribal cultures, what we might think of as primitive cultures, is to miss things that could help us in those cultures. A sense of integration into existence, for example. Right? Many tribal cultures had, and in some cases have, a sense of being part of existence, part of nature. The Yukagurs of Siberia, for example, don't have a word for nature. It's not a separate thing that it ever occurred to them to name because they don't think of nature as separate from people and culture. So how can you have a sense of belonging in the world if you've already assumed you don't belong? Fundamentally, the very terms of your thought process about life is, I'm separate from existence. Nature's out there and I'm over here. That's an alienating premise right off the bat. So, in a sense, this idea of specialization runs that deep. In other words, Western civilization has this idea that humans themselves are specialized aspects of nature instead of integrated into it. This is actually a strange concept when you think about it in the bigger context of human cultures across time and space, but also really just intellectually, the idea that we are separate. Where do we get that idea? And even just biologically, physically, if you think of us as matter and not even as spirit, our atoms and molecules are constantly being exchanged with our environment. So a carbon atom in your nose was once in a dinosaur, in the air, in a plant, and ultimately out in space. As Joni Mitchell sang, we are stardust. So breaking things down into parts can obviously be helpful for specific things. It's not helpful when talking about the deepest, most meaningful things, meaning itself, a sense of fullness and aliveness. Western culture has failed us in that regard. We need to know what we can look to our culture for and what we can't. We need to have some perspective on our own culture. And my book of Geometry and Jesus, the subtitle is Essays from Outside the Fishbowl of Western Culture. So Western culture does many things wonderfully, but it doesn't do so well with the whole. A good metaphor, I think, is there's a delightful frog hopping around. You want to study what makes it alive, so you kill it and dissect it. And now it's reeking of formaldehyde and lying on a desk in front of you. And you're saying, where's the life? What makes this frog so delightful? Well, you've already killed it, so you'll never know. Killing the Frog. Maybe that will be my next book. Don't steal that title, okay?